My name is Dr. Ellen Whitford, and the moment the nurse called me, director in front of my father-in-law, he went so pale, I thought he might faint again. For a second, the entire world froze. The beeping monitors, the shuffling footsteps, even the harsh fluorescent lights in the ICU hallway. He finally realized the woman he had spent years belittling, mocking, and dismissing as just a small-town doctor was the one leading the team that had just saved his life. But that moment, the shock on his face, the fear tightening his jaw, didn't come from nowhere. It was born from years of quiet hurt, swallowed pride, and the steady erosion of respect inside a family that valued money far more than character. People often assume that small towns are gentle places, where everyone knows your name, and kindness sits on every front porch. And sometimes that's true. I've lived my whole life in Bloomington, Indiana, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. I love the limestone buildings downtown, the late summer fairs, the way neighbors still wave when they drive by. I love my job at the community hospital, even on the days it breaks my heart. But being a small-town doctor comes with its own shadows. People think they know everything about you, including your worth. My father-in-law, Harold Whitford, was one of those people. Harold had a habit of measuring everyone around him by their income. If you made less than 6 figures, he assumed something was wrong with you. Maybe you were lazy or unambitious, or just plain disappointing. And he loved to say it out loud, especially after a couple of beers. His favorite target was me. It didn't matter that I had been a doctor for 30 years. It didn't matter that I delivered half the babies born in our county in the late 90s, or that I sat beside families during their worst nights, or that I held hands with people who had no one else. None of that counted, because I wasn't rich. But my sister-in-law, Vanessa, now she was the success story. Vanessa sold houses, good at it, I'll give her that. She talked fast, wore expensive shoes, and liked taking pictures of herself next to shiny kitchen islands. And Harold ate it up. Every visit, every holiday, every Sunday lunch, he'd brag about her latest sale, her commissions, her new car, whatever she posted online. Meanwhile, I'd walk in the door straight from a 12-hour shift, hair a mess, shoes still dusty from the ER floor, and Harold would look at me like I'd tracked in mud from the yard. There she is, the doctor who could have been something he'd say loud enough for the whole table to hear, if she had pushed a little harder. It didn't matter how many times my husband Mark tried to intervene. Mark is gentle, patient, and naturally conflict avoidant. He'd place a hand on my knee under the table or pull his father aside afterward. But Harold's mindset was carved in stone. He respected money. He worshipped money. And he believed the only measure of a person's value was the size of their bank account. One Thanksgiving stands out. We had a dozen people packed around the long oak table in Harold's farmhouse. Vanessa showed up 30 minutes late, breezing in with her fur-trimmed coat and a store-bought pie. Harold lit up like a Christmas tree. He practically tripped over himself to pull out a chair for her. "Oh, sweetheart, tell everyone about that big closing you had last week. The one for $800,000. She flipped her hair and smiled. "Well, it was nothing really. I was carving the turkey. Literally, carving the turkey. Standing there with my sleeves rolled up while Harold made a grand announcement that Vanessa was the pride of the Whitford family. Then he turned toward me. "And Ellen here, well, she's doing whatever it is she does at that little hospital." People laughed. I didn't. I kept slicing the turkey steady, as you please. But inside, something tightened. I'd learned to hide it well, but humiliation like that collects over the years, settling in quiet corners of the heart. Still, I never talked back. And I never bragged about my job. I didn't flaunt the fact that the community hospital trusted me with some of our toughest cases. I didn't tell Harold that I was more than a doctor. I was the person families asked for by name when things got scary. I didn't tell him that our staff looked up to me or that administrators had been urging me to take a leadership role for years. It wasn't his business, and honestly, I didn't need his approval. But even so, the comments stung, because they came from someone who should have known me better. Everything started to shift the spring. Harold turned 75. He'd been slowing down for a while, coughing, more, breathing, heavier, complaining about his legs, feeling thick. I offered to check him out gently, suggesting we run a few tests, but he waved me off. "You're a doctor, sure," he said, "but I need a real specialist. Someone from a bigger hospital. You know, someone who knows what they're doing." I bit down hard on my tongue. Mark tried talking sense into him, but Harold refused. He didn't want advice from someone he believed spent her career in a tiny clinic, his words. He wanted a shiny, prestigious doctor in a big city. He never made that appointment. By early summer, he was dragging himself from chair to chair around the house. Vanessa kept telling him he just needed vitamins. I could have screamed. I saw all the signs, heart failure, creeping in like a slow tide. But Harold wouldn't listen. Pride is a stubborn disease. Then came the day everything snapped into place. It was a brutally hot Saturday in July, and we were all at Harold's house for a family barbecue. I noticed the way he kept leaning on furniture, the way he couldn't catch his breath, how his skin turned the faint color of wet paper. I walked over to him quietly. "Harold, you need medical attention. Now." He opened his mouth to argue, but instead he collapsed. Just collapsed. When the paramedics rushed him to the hospital, I followed in my car. My heart wasn't racing out of panic. I'd seen worse, but out of something deeper. A sense of responsibility, a sense of impending truth. And when I walked into that ICU hallway, the nurse spotted me. She straightened, stepped aside respectfully, and said exactly what Harold had never imagined. "Director Whitford, the team is ready for you." I heard Harold gasp from the bed. That was the moment everything changed. The first night Harold was in the ICU, the silence in the family waiting room felt heavy enough to crack. Vanessa paced back and forth in heels that clicked sharply against the tile, each step punctuating her frustration. Mark sat beside me, elbows on his knees, rubbing his forehead the way he always did when stress fogged his thoughts. The TV mounted high on the wall played one of those true crime rerun shows, but none of us were paying attention. I sat quietly, still wearing the same clothes I'd worn to the barbecue, a faded blue blouse and jeans. My hospital badge was clipped to my belt, and the word, Director, printed under my name, still caught Vanessa's eye every few minutes. She kept glancing at it, like she was trying to understand a math problem that didn't add up. Finally she spoke. Director since, when her tone hovered between disbelief and irritation, as if I had somehow tricked the hospital into giving me authority. "About 2 years," I said simply. Vanessa blinked. "Why didn't you say anything Dad thought?" "I know what your dad thought." That shut her up for a moment. The truth is, I never hid my position. I just didn't talk about it, because I've always believed your work should speak for you. In small-town America, especially in places like Bloomington, people appreciate humility. They don't like it when professionals puff themselves up. And besides, I didn't need to win anyone's approval. I loved my job, and that was enough for me. But not for Harold. For as long as I'd known him, he believed Vanessa walked on water. She made money, So in his mind, she was successful. He'd repeat the same lines over and over at family gatherings. She's brilliant at what she does. She's got drive. She's got ambition. Then, with that familiar side glance at me, some people settle for less. I remember a particular moment 2 years earlier. Vanessa had just leased a new luxury SUV with a giant chrome emblem on the grille that practically reflected the whole neighborhood. We'd come by Harold's house to drop off groceries, and he insisted that we all go outside and admire the car. He walked around it like he was touring a national monument. "Isn't she something?" he asked proudly. "Vanessa knows how to move up in life." I glanced at the SUV and nodded politely. Meanwhile, I drove an 11-year-old Subaru Forester scratched on the side from a parking lot mishap. It wasn't pretty, but it carried me safely through snowstorms and 2 a.m. medical emergencies. Harold never once commented on its reliability, only its age. But what he didn't know was that the Subaru was paid off, and Vanessa's SUV wasn't. She financed every bit of her glamorous life. High interest rates, late payments, maxed out credit cards, her entire lifestyle was a castle built on sand. Small towns have long memories, and Bloomington, Indiana was no exception. People talked, and I heard bits and pieces over the years, rumors about Vanessa falling behind on a mortgage for a flip project, whispers about aggressive collection calls. I never repeated any of it. It wasn't my place. Still watching Harold feed his obsession with Vanessa's image, this illusion of perfection hurt more than I ever admitted out loud. The older generation in America often clings to symbols of success. Fancy cars, big houses, expensive clothes. It's something I see in patients too. They worry more about what their neighbors will think than what their bodies are telling them. And Harold was the poster child for that mindset. But Harold's praise wasn't limited to big achievements. He celebrated even the smallest things Vanessa did. When she bought a new pair of shoes, look at the quality, real leather. When she posted a picture of a beautifully staged kitchen, see that counter? That's quartz, not cheap stuff. When she told him she closed another sale, she's pulling more than $100,000 this year. I just know it. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't need truth. He wanted the fantasy. Meanwhile, I'd come home from grueling shifts, sometimes dealing with heartbreaking losses, and Harold would shrug dismissively when I mentioned work. "Oh," he'd say, waving a hand, "busy day at the little hospital." That phrase, "the little hospital," was his favorite weapon, as if community hospitals weren't the backbone of our entire medical system, as if the countless lives saved there were somehow less important than someone signing real estate contracts. Mark tried standing up for me. He really did. He wasn't blind to the favoritism. But Harold had a way of brushing off any correction, especially from his own son. He'd say things like, "I'm just telling the truth," or "don't be sensitive." The classic phrases people use when they want to hurt you, but also hide from accountability. I kept my composure because losing it wouldn't change anything. I wasn't raised to fight for attention or praise. My parents taught me that if you do good work, God sees it, even if people don't. That lesson stayed with me all my life. Still, it hurt. One evening, a year or so before Harold collapsed, we were all gathered at a local steakhouse for his birthday. Vanessa walked in wearing a sparkling gold dress, the kind you'd see at a gala. Everyone turned to look at her. Harold stood up, applauding, like she'd won an award. Then he introduced her to the guests at the next table, complete strangers, just so he could brag about her career. When it came time to introduce me, he hesitated and then said, "And this is my daughter-in-law, Ellen. She's a doctor. Not the high-end kind, you know, but she tries. The strangers laughed. That laugh stayed with me for months. I held on to my dignity that night, but deep inside, something hardened. Not anger, not revenge, just a cold awareness that Harold didn't see me. Not my work, not my heart, not the years of service I'd poured into the community. Fast forward to the ICU waiting room. Vanessa sat down, her shoulders slumped. For the first time, she looked small, almost fragile. Dad always talked about you like... She paused. Like your job wasn't real. I guess I believed him. I didn't respond. Not yet. She stared at the floor. I didn't know you were a director. You didn't ask, I replied gently. She looked up. Why didn't you ever tell him? You could have shut him up ages ago. I exhaled slowly, because his approval was never the thing I was missing. There was a long, quiet stretch after that. Even the TV seemed to lower its volume. But deep in my chest, something shifted. The balance of power in our family, quietly, subtly, had begun to tilt. And Harold had no idea what was waiting for him when he woke up. The morning after Harold's collapse, I arrived at the hospital before sunrise. Bloomington was still half asleep, the streets wet with dew, the scent of early summer clinging to the air. Inside the hospital, everything felt familiar. The soft hum of machines, the polite greetings from night shift nurses, the muffled footsteps on polished floors. This place had been my second home for decades. I knew its rhythms the way a farmer knows the land. But that morning, something felt different. Maybe it was the shifting dynamic in my family, or maybe it was the weight of truth finally catching up with Harold. Either way, I walked into the ICU with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Harold was awake, though still weak. His cheeks had lost color, and his breath came in shallow pulls. Vanessa was sitting beside him, scrolling through her phone, her foundation slightly smudged. Mark stood at the foot of the bed, trying, too hard, to look calm. Harold turned his head when he saw me, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't speak. He just stared, as if trying to reconcile the image in his mind with the one in front of him. I stepped closer. Good morning, Harold. How are you feeling? His voice was raspy. They said, You're the director. Yes, I said simply. I've been serving as medical director for a while now. He swallowed hard, his eyes flicking away. I thought you worked in a clinic. I did, and then I didn't. Silence settled over the room. Vanessa finally put her phone away, sensing the weight of the moment. Dad, she said softly, Ellen's the one who kept everyone calm last night. He blinked, confused. Everyone? Mark stepped forward. Dad. She led the whole team. If she hadn't, he cleared his throat. You might not be here. Harold looked at me again, and this time I saw something new in his eyes. Not quite fear, not quite guilt, but the fragile beginnings of realization. I didn't need him to say anything. Not yet. It was enough that he understood the truth he'd ignored for years. After checking Harold's charts and speaking with the nurses, I stepped into the hallway. Mark followed me. He's quiet, Mark said. He's processing, I replied. It's a lot to accept. Mark exhaled heavily. Ellen, thank you for yesterday, for everything. You don't need to thank me. He's family. Mark nodded, though his eyes shone with something like regret. I should have defended you more strongly over the years. I touched his arm. You did what you could. We stood there for a moment, the hallway buzzing gently around us. Then a voice called out from behind. Director Whitford, we need you in exam 3. I excused myself and walked briskly down the corridor, leaving Mark to handle his father's simmering guilt. Later that afternoon, Cracks in Vanessa's polished image began to show. I found her alone in the waiting room, pacing again, but this time her face carried an anxious tightness I hadn't seen before. She froze when she noticed me. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. "Of course." We sat in a corner where sunlight filtered through the blinds in narrow stripes. Vanessa hesitated. "I know you've heard things. About my business." I stayed neutral. "What kind of things?" She let out a shaky breath. "I'm in trouble, Ellen. Real trouble." Her confession spilled out like water through a broken dam. A failed flip project in Indianapolis. An unpaid contractor threatening legal action. 3 mortgages past due. A credit score spiraling downward. And the biggest blow, a pending tax audit, triggered by inconsistencies she blamed on her accountant. Harold, of course, knew none of this. He'd fall apart if he found out, she whispered. I didn't respond immediately. Vanessa's world had always been built around appearance. The cars, the clothes, the staged photos, it was all designed to convince others she was thriving, but beneath it lay a truth she could no longer contain. Finally, I spoke gently. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because Dad expected me to be the shining star." Her voice cracked. I couldn't disappoint him. Not after he put everything on me. Not after he kept saying I was the one doing something worthwhile. A wave of sympathy washed over me. Harold hadn't just put her on a pedestal, he'd chained her to it. And she'd been carrying the weight alone. "Vanessa," I said softly, "everyone has struggles. Success isn't about pretending." She shook her head, not in Dad's eyes. I thought about all the years. Harold compared us, creating a silent competition I never agreed to. Vanessa wasn't just the favorite. She was the pressure point of his dreams, a reminder of everything he valued. No wonder she was breaking. Before I could respond, a voice called out, "Family of Harold Whitford." We stood and walked toward the doctor, a younger colleague of mine. "Mr. Whitford's condition is stable," he said, "but he's showing signs of worsening heart failure. We'll need to perform an echocardiogram and adjust his medication." Vanessa looked panicked. "Is he going to make it?" "He's in good hands," I said before the doctor could reply. When we returned to Harold's room, he was breathing slightly easier, but still looked fragile. He watched us enter his gaze, landing on Vanessa first. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked. She nodded, blinking rapidly. "I'm fine." Then he looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time in years. "I didn't know," he murmured. "Didn't know what?" I asked gently. "What you really do, who you really are." I met his eyes. "You never asked." He closed his eyes, pained by more than illness. Over the next few days, I noticed Harold observing every interaction between me and the hospital staff. Nurses addressed me with respect. Physicians consulted me about cases. Administrators deferred to my judgment. And slowly, piece by piece, his long-held picture of me crumbled. The illusion he'd built around Vanessa was crumbling too. And underneath it all, the truth, messy, human, unavoidable, was rising to the surface. Harold wasn't just fighting heart failure. He was facing the uncomfortable reckoning of a lifetime spent praising the wrong things. Harold's deterioration came faster than any of us expected. Heart failure has a way of sneaking up on people, slow at first, like a whisper you can ignore, then suddenly, loud enough to drown out everything else. Even with medication and careful monitoring, his body was exhausted from years of untreated symptoms. And now that he was confined to a hospital bed, facing the reality he had always refused to see, the emotional weight pressed down on him just as heavily as the physical. I visited him early each morning, before my administrative rounds. Sometimes he was awake, staring out the window at the parking lot below. Other times, he pretended to be asleep, to avoid conversation. I didn't push him. Healing, physical or emotional, never happens when you force it. One morning, I stood at his bedside, going through his chart when he spoke quietly. "Ellen, did you know this was coming?" I turned to him. "I suspected it months ago, but you didn't want an evaluation." He winced, not from pain, but from memory. "I thought you were being dramatic. I thought you wanted to look smart in front of me." I kept my voice even. "I wanted you healthy." He nodded slowly, eyes glossy. "I didn't treat you right." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him, and for now, it was enough. Vanessa arrived later that morning, looking more disheveled than usual. Her makeup was lighter, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Without the armor of luxury accessories, she looked younger and more vulnerable. "Dad," she whispered as she sat beside him, "you scared us." Harold reached for her hand. "You're still my pride, sweetheart." I saw it immediately, the relief washing over Vanessa like warm water. Despite everything crumbling around her finances, despite the truth unraveling behind closed doors, Harold still clung to the one storyline he had always believed, that Vanessa was the shining symbol of success. And yet, her eyes flickered toward me, guilt twisting her expression. She knew the pedestal was built on sand, and she knew Harold didn't have the strength to face that fact, not yet. 3 days into Harold's hospital stay, everything came crashing down. He'd been moved out of the ICU into a step-down unit, which was a good sign. Mark and Vanessa were in the room when he suddenly began gasping for breath. I was just a few doors down, reviewing discharge summaries, when I heard the alarm. A nurse rushed past me, calling urgently for respiratory support. I ran. By the time I entered the room, Harold was hunched forward, gripping the sheets, his face turning a dangerous shade of gray. Vanessa screamed. Mark jumped to steady his father's shoulder. I snapped immediately into medical mode, every emotion dropping into a still, calm pool inside me. "Move aside," I said firmly. The team poured in behind me, a respiratory therapist, 2 nurses, another physician. And then came the moment Harold would remember for the rest of his life. The nurse turned to me and said, loud and clear, "Director Whitford, we're waiting on your call." Harold's eyes widened, panic mixed with recognition and regret. His breath came in ragged gulps, not only because his lungs were struggling, but because the truth hit him harder than the arrhythmia ever could. Vanessa froze, staring at the staff as if she'd never seen me before. "Ellen?" Mark whispered, more proud than frightened. I placed oxygen support, ordered a stat IV diuretic, coordinated vitals, and instructed the respiratory therapist to prepare for a potential BiPAP. Every request was met instantly because the team trusted me. Within minutes, Harold's breathing began to stabilize. His color improved. The frantic beeping of machines softened into their normal rhythm. Only once he was safe did I step back. Harold stared at me, trembling. You saved my life. Again." "I'm your doctor," I said. "That's what I do." Tears pooled in his eyes. He looked away, unable to hold my gaze. For the first time since I'd met him, Harold was forced to confront the truth he'd ignored for years. His daughter-in-law, the one he dismissed as not successful enough, was the very person who kept his heart beating. Later that evening, after the crisis subsided, Vanessa approached me in the hallway. She looked shaken, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Ellen, I had no idea. The way they listened to you. The way you led the whole team." That's my job, I said gently. No, she whispered. It's more than that. Dad never understood what you do. I didn't either. She paused, biting her lip. I always thought success meant looking successful. I tilted my head. Does it still feel that way now? Her eyes flooded with tears she didn't bother to hide. No, I feel like I've been living a lie and dragging Dad into it. She told me quietly about the debts, the foreclosure notices, piling up the calls she was dodging. Her life was collapsing under the weight of pretending. You don't have to pretend anymore, I said. Not with me. She nodded, the relief overwhelming her. That night, Mark and I walked to the hospital's small cafeteria for coffee. It was nearly empty, except for a few night shift nurses grabbing snacks. Mark took a long sip and sighed. I've never been prouder of you. I smiled softly. You don't need to be proud, just supportive. He reached for my hand across the table. I always have been, even when Dad couldn't see it. We sat there in the dim lights, exhaustion settling over us. But beneath the fatigue was something else, something new. Balance. For the first time, Harold's opinion no longer overshadowed the truth. The pedestal he'd built for Vanessa had cracks too deep to hide, and the quiet strength he ignored in me now stood front and center, undeniable. In that collapse, physical, emotional, and symbolic, the entire family was forced to see each other clearly. Harold wasn't just recovering from a heart condition. He was recovering from a lifetime of misplaced values. And I knew the reckoning wasn't over yet. Harold woke up the next morning, looking smaller somehow, as if the crisis the day before had carved away the arrogance he'd worn like a coat for years. His cheeks were pale, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his water cup. But what struck me most was his eyes. They were softer, unsure, searching. When I walked in, he didn't look away the way he usually did. Instead, he stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Ellen, he said quietly, can we talk? Vanessa was in the room, pretending to check her phone. Mark sat beside her, leaning forward attentively. But Harold's gaze was locked on me. I nodded. Of course. He shifted uncomfortably against the pillows. I owe you an apology. A real one. Not the half-hearted kind I've given people over the years. I stood still waiting. I've spent too long judging you, he continued. Comparing you. Thinking your work didn't matter. Because it didn't come with flash. His breath wavered. But you saved my life. Twice. That's what doctors do, I said gently. No, he insisted, shaking his head. It's what you did. Vanessa's eyes glistened. Mark exhaled. Harold swallowed hard. I thought Vanessa had everything figured out. I thought you were just average. A doctor, sure, but one who didn't aim high. His voice trembled. Turns out, I was the one who didn't know anything. I stepped closer to check his IV line. Harold being a doctor in a small town doesn't make me less. It's a privilege to serve people you've known your whole life. To be present for births, losses, and everything in between. That's not small. Not to me. He blinked rapidly, struggling to maintain composure. I never saw that. I saw money. I always saw money. That was the truth he'd been unwilling to face. Not just now, but for decades. His own father had taught him that wealth was proof of character, and he'd carried that belief like a badge of honor. What he didn't realize until now was how much harm it caused. After adjusting his oxygen tube, I said softly, success isn't about what you earn. It's about how you live, who you help, what you stand for. Harold's lips trembled. And you've been standing for the right things all along. The room was silent, except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Vanessa suddenly stood up. "Dad," she said, voice quivering, "there's something I need to tell you." Harold turned his head toward her, concern clouding his expression. I haven't been honest," she said, "about my business, about how things are going." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard. "Dad, I'm not doing well. I haven't been for a long time. The closing numbers I bragged about, they were sporadic. And the expensive stuff, I bought it on credit. A lot of credit." Harold's mouth opened, but no words came. Vanessa continued, words tumbling out, as if she'd been holding them back for years. "I thought if I kept up the image, you'd be proud of me. I didn't want you to feel like you backed the wrong daughter-in-law. I didn't want you to be disappointed." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But the truth is, I'm drowning. Debts, missed payments. I'm barely keeping my head above water." Harold looked stunned, not angry, just stunned. "I didn't know," he whispered. "Because I didn't let you know," she said. "I let you believe the story you wanted to believe." I watched Harold absorb this truth, the crumbling image of the daughter he'd always championed. The shock didn't come from judgment, but from realizing he'd built his values around illusions. Finally, Harold turned to me. "All this time, you were the strong one." I shook my head. "No, we've all been strong in different ways, but we've also all been hiding things." He blinked slowly. "What were you hiding?" I sat down beside him and folded my hands. "That work, like mine, comes with a quiet weight. You see suffering. You carry secrets. You hold dying hands and reassure families. You do it without applause. I didn't need praise from you, but I did hope, one day, you might see me as more than a number on a paycheck." Harold's chin quivered. "I see you now. It was enough, more than enough." Later that afternoon, I found Vanessa sitting by herself in the hospital courtyard, staring at the small fountain in the center. I sat beside her. "You were brave," I said. She gave a hollow laugh. "No, I was desperate." "Both can be true." Vanessa hugged her arms around herself. "Ellen, I never hated you. Dad just made me feel like I had to be the shiny one. So I played the part." I nodded. "I know. Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" "For the debt, yes. For the lies, that might take time." She glanced upward. "And you?" "I forgave you a long time ago," I said, "because I realized you weren't competing with me. You were competing with his expectations." Vanessa wiped her cheeks. "I'm so tired of pretending." "Then stop," I said simply. "Start fresh. Ask for help when you need it. And don't measure your life by anyone else's yardstick." She breathed out shakily. "I want to." "Good," I said, standing. "Because the first step to real success is honesty." When I returned to Harold's room, the nurses were adjusting his medications. He looked steadier, calmer. He reached for my hand, something he'd never done before. "Ellen," he said, voice thin but sincere, "thank you for not giving up on this family, even when I didn't deserve it." I squeezed his hand gently. Families don't fall apart from imperfection. They fall apart when we stop telling each other the truth. He nodded slowly. "I want to make things right." And for the first time, I believed he meant it. Harold's recovery over the next week was slow but steady. His color improved, his breathing evened out, and his appetite returned in small steps. But the biggest change wasn't physical, it was something else entirely. Something softer, quieter. The edges of his personality, once sharp with judgment and pride, began to round out as he faced truths he had avoided for most of his life. Every morning, I'd stop by before my administrative duties, Sometimes he'd be awake, watching the sunrise melt through the blinds. Other times, he'd doze lightly, his hands resting gently over the blanket. But whenever he saw me, he no longer looked away. He watched me with the humility of someone trying to learn a new language, late in life, the language of appreciation. One morning, as I adjusted his bed and checked his vitals, he spoke in a low, hesitant voice. "Ellen, do you think people can change? At my age?" I looked at him carefully. People can grow at any age, but real change takes courage. He nodded slowly. "I want to be better. I want to understand the things I dismissed." I softened. "Then start by listening, really listening." He closed his eyes, letting the words settle. Vanessa, meanwhile, was unraveling, but in a necessary way. She came to the hospital every day, though her appearance gradually transformed. The luxury handbags stopped coming. The makeup lightened. The designer heels were replaced with simple flats. It wasn't because she suddenly stopped caring about her looks. It was because she was shedding a heavy costume she'd worn too long. One afternoon, I found her in the family lounge, staring at a thick stack of paperwork. Her brow was furrowed, her fingers trembling. "What's all this?" I asked gently. "My debts," she whispered. "I printed everything. I figured it was time to stop hiding from the numbers." I sat beside her. "That's a big step." She nodded, eyes glassy. "I didn't realize how bad it was. Ellen, I owe more than I make in a year." "You don't have to do this alone," I said. She shook her head. "I need to. I created this mess." "That doesn't mean you're unworthy of support." She swallowed hard. "Do you think Dad will help me?" I sighed softly. "I think he will. But you need to tell him the whole truth, not just pieces." She looked down. "I'm scared." Being honest is one of the bravest things a person can do. Vanessa exhaled shakily. "I wish I had been more like you." I shook my head. "Be more like you, just the real you, not the version you thought he wanted." 2 days later, the moment finally came. Harold was sitting up in bed, looking more alert than he had in days. Vanessa pulled a chair close and took a deep breath. "Dad," she began softly, "I need to tell you everything." He watched her with patient concern, and then she told him about the debts, the missed payments, the risky properties, the facade she'd been maintaining. She described the fear that followed her everywhere, the shame she carried, and the exhaustion of pretending to be someone she wasn't. When she finished, she waited for his anger, but it didn't come. Instead, Harold's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, sweetheart, you didn't have to carry all that alone." She covered her face with her hands, crying openly. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I pushed you into thinking money was everything. I thought I was encouraging you, but I was blind." Vanessa leaned into his hand when he reached for her. "Dad, I just wanted you to be proud." "I am proud," he said, voice cracking. "Not because of the money, because you're strong enough to start over." I stood quietly near the doorway, watching the scene unfold. It felt like something fragile knitting itself back together, painful, necessary, and long overdue. Later that afternoon, Harold turned to me. "Ellen," he said, "I want to talk to you for a moment." I approached his bedside. "I said some awful things to you over the years," he murmured. "Things I'm ashamed to even remember." I didn't respond immediately. I wanted him to continue. "You didn't deserve any of it. I put money on a pedestal, and I used it to measure everyone, including you." His eyes shimmered with regret. "You helped more people in this town than I ever did. You saved lives. You showed kindness when no one was watching, and I looked down on you because you didn't brag about it. I rested my hand lightly on the bed railing. This town taught me that work with purpose doesn't need applause, and I didn't want to live my life proving myself to anyone. He nodded slowly. And that makes you wealthier than I've ever been. His words weren't polished or poetic. They were raw and real, and they meant more than any apology he could have scripted. Thank you, I said quietly. I want to make things right, he continued. With you, with Vanessa, with Mark, with myself. Then start by living differently, I said. Your values don't have to stay the same, just because your years do. He smiled weakly. Would you help me understand what matters? Of course, I said. That's what family does. The next few days were filled with hard conversations, but also healing ones. Vanessa and I went through her financial papers together. I connected her with a trusted financial advisor from town. Mark attended every meeting with her, offering the steady presence she had never let herself lean on before. Harold began attending sessions with a hospital counselor, something he never would have agreed to before. He listened more, talked less, and asked questions without defensiveness. For the first time, our family wasn't operating on illusions. We were operating on truth. And in that truth, everyone grew. One evening, as I prepared Harold's discharge instructions, he reached for my hand again. You saved my life, he said softly. But more than that, you saved my family. I squeezed his hand gently. No, Harold, you're saving your family by choosing honesty, humility, and change. He smiled with tired gratitude. I'm learning from the best. And as I looked at him, truly looked, I realized something. This wasn't revenge. This was transformation, the quiet justice that comes from truth finally being seen. Harold was discharged on a warm Friday afternoon. The sky over Bloomington was a soft, forgiving blue, dotted with clouds, drifting lazily over the town. Mark pulled the car around, while Vanessa and I walked Harold out in a wheelchair. He looked fragile, thinner than before, moving slower, but there was a calmness in him I'd never seen, a gentleness, a willingness to observe instead of judge. When we got him settled at home, the old farmhouse felt different too. Not because anything had changed physically. Harold's recliner still sat near the window. The wooden cabinets still hummed with decades of stories, but because the energy around him had softened. He was quieter, more thoughtful. He looked at the world with new eyes. That evening, we gathered around the living room. Vanessa made a simple dinner pasta and salad, nothing fancy. And for the first time in years, she looked relaxed as she set plates on the table, not performing, not impressing, just being herself. Harold cleared his throat when we sat down. Before we eat, he began, I want to say something. Vanessa and Mark looked at him expectantly. I stayed still, sensing the weight of what was coming. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he said slowly, about the kind of man I've been, and it wasn't a good one. He paused, eyes glistening. I spent so many years believing money made people worthy. That success meant wealth, and that failure meant everything else. He swallowed. But I was wrong. About all of it. Vanessa reached for his hand. Mark leaned forward. Harold turned his gaze to me. And Ellen, I was especially wrong about you. The living room fell silent. I judged you, he said, voice trembling. I dismissed your work, doubted your accomplishments, and talked down to you for reasons I can't even justify now. But you saved my life. You gave me something no amount of money could buy. I met his eyes gently. Harold, what matters is that you see it now. He shook his head. No, what matters is that I admit it. He exhaled shakily. I was proud of the wrong things. I praised the wrong people for the wrong reasons. I hurt you. I hurt Vanessa. And I put pressure on this family that we didn't deserve. Vanessa wiped her tears. Dad, it wasn't all your fault. He squeezed her hand. Maybe not, but I played my part in making you feel like you had to perform. And I'm sorry. Vanessa bowed her head, letting the apology wash over her. Harold looked at me again. You were the one holding this family together, quietly, steadily, without asking for gratitude. I never needed gratitude, I said softly. I just needed honesty. He nodded. And you have it now. For the first time in a long time, it felt true. Over the next weeks, Harold's life slowed down. Mark and I drove him to appointments. Vanessa helped him organize his bills and medications. He spent afternoons reading on the porch, listening to birds settle in the oak tree he planted decades ago. Sometimes I'd sit beside him, after work, drinking iced tea, while the sun dipped behind the cornfields. One of those evenings, he spoke quietly. I always thought being a doctor in a town like this meant you didn't make it. I raised an eyebrow. And what do you think now? He gazed at the field, glowing gold in the fading light. I think you made it, in all the ways that matter. A gentle smile warmed my chest. Thank you, Harold. You know, he continued shifting slowly in his chair that moment in the hospital, when the nurse said, Director, it scared me at first. Not because I was sick, but because I finally saw how wrong I'd been. It's like everything I believed cracked open. Growth can feel like that, I said. Like breaking before rebuilding. He nodded thoughtfully. I guess that's what happened. We fell into a quiet rhythm. After that, no judgment, no tension, just peace. Vanessa's journey was harder, but she walked it bravely. With the help of the financial advisor, I connected her. She began negotiating payments, consolidating debt, and letting go of the lifestyle that had nearly swallowed her whole. She sold the luxury SUV, she cleaned out her closet. She even took a second job doing staging for a local furniture store. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. One afternoon, she stopped by my office with a box. Thought you'd want these, she said. Inside were high-end shoes and handbags, symbols of her old life. I'm donating them, she explained. They don't feel like me anymore. I hugged her gently. You're doing great. She exhaled shakily. It's hard, but for the first time in years, I feel like I'm breathing. I smiled. That's how you know you're rebuilding something real. 3 months after Harold's collapse, we had a small family dinner, just the 4 of us. No bragging, no comparisons, no tension simmering beneath polite conversation. Instead, we laughed. We shared stories. We passed dishes. We talked about dreams that weren't tied to money or status. At one point, Harold raised his glass. To my family, he said, for teaching me what matters, for showing me that success isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch the truth, we live, and the love we give. We clinked glasses gently. Later that night, as I walked Harold to his room, he paused in the hallway. Ellen. Yes. His voice softened. I'm grateful for you, more than I ever said. I touched his arm. That's all I ever wanted. And so this is the justice I found, quiet, steady, and rooted in truth. Not the flashy kind, not the dramatic kind, but the kind that transforms hearts instead of breaking them. My father-in-law didn't change overnight. No one does. But he learned, he listened, he softened, and in that change, our family found something we didn't know we were missing. respect, honesty, humility, peace. If you're listening to my story, I want to leave you with this. Success is not loud. Worth is not measured in wealth. And the people who love quietly, steadily, and without applause, they are the real pillars of our lives. Hold them close, see them clearly, and if you are one of them, know that your quiet strength is a gift. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that real value isn't something you can buy. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stay with us. There's always another lesson waiting.